The first thing Darren Voss did every morning was check the perimeter. Not because the station required it. The Vethkai Conclave's automated systems could do that faster and more thoroughly than any human. He checked it because it was the only thing on this rock that was entirely his to control. Outpost Karini 7. A crescent-shaped platform anchored to the upper atmosphere of a gas giant 200 light-years from the nearest human colony. It had been built by the Vethkai to serve as a neutral waypoint, a place where the various species of the arm could conduct the kind of business that didn't survive official channels. It orbited in permanent twilight, half swallowed by the planet's perpetual amber storms below, upper decks silvered by a distant white sun. It was beautiful in the way that very dangerous things sometimes are, and Darren Voss had spent 4 years learning all the ways it could kill you. He moved through the lower corridors with his hands loose at his sides, not checking his sidearm, but aware of it the way a man is aware of his heartbeat. The walls here were older Vethkai construction, dark alloy panels veined with bioluminescent conduit, the whole corridor breathing faint cyan light with each atmospheric shift. It smelled like ozone and something sweet, like overripe fruit. He'd stopped noticing the smell after the first month. He'd stopped noticing a lot of things. That was either wisdom or damage, and he'd given up trying to figure out which. He had come to this outpost the way most human contractors came to places this far out, by the slow process of narrowing options until there was only one left. To tour with the Colonial Authorities Protection Corps. 1 bad year doing private work for the syndicate, which he didn't talk about. A year after that where the options had been genuinely few, and a conversation with a Vethkai logistics coordinator who had offered him a posting so far from the inner systems that even the news feeds ran slow. He'd taken it. He'd told himself it was tactical. He'd known, somewhere underneath that it was retreat. There was a difference between those two things, and he had decided not to examine it too closely. 4 years later, he knew every system on this station and could read every species it hosted, and had made exactly 0 friends, which was not a complaint, just an accounting. He ran the perimeter every morning and checked every screen and ate alone in the small human-compatible kitchen they'd installed on level 3, and he did not think about his sister more than twice a day, which he considered a reasonable achievement. What he hadn't given up on was the rule. It had started as a professional position, something he'd arrived at during that bad year with the syndicate, when he'd learned that emotional investment in an asset was a liability in the mathematical sense, a cost that showed up at the worst possible moment in the form of a hesitation, a miscalculation, a choice made in the fog of caring rather than the clarity of purpose. One principle applied without exception: nobody gets close to the asset, not aides, not attachés, not diplomats with credentials thick as your fist, not the asset themselves, in any way that mattered. You kept the asset alive by keeping the asset away from everyone who might want them dead, and you kept yourself functional by not letting the asset become a person to you. He had broken that rule exactly once. He didn't let himself think about that right now. The asset in question was the 3rd daughter of the Vethkai Luminants, a royal title that translated roughly, and inadequately, as princess. Her name was Sail Vethmira, and she had been scheduled to arrive at Outpost Karini 6 hours ago with a full diplomatic security detail and a formal transit docket. She had arrived 8 minutes ago instead, aboard an unmarked courier shuttle with a scrambled transponder, and an approach vector that suggested someone who knew exactly how to slip through a beacon grid without triggering the automated hailing protocols. Darren had found her in the secondary docking bay, sitting on a cargo crate with the careful stillness of someone managing pain, bleeding from a cut along her left cranial ridge. Vethkai had 3 of those arched cartilage structures that ran back from their brow line like crests, the physical characteristic that most clearly distinguished them from the dozen other humanoid species common in this part of the arm. The cut was fresh. The blood was the dark copper color of Vethkai circulatory fluid. Her diplomatic robes were torn at the shoulder, and her skin markings, bioluminescent patches along her cheekbones and collarbone that AI used for social signaling, involuntarily and constantly, were the slow, deep amber of someone trying very hard to appear composed. He had looked at her. She had looked at him. And she had said, in heavily accented standard that carried the precise, overcorrect grammar of someone who had learned the language from written materials rather than conversation, "I was told that you are the human who operates the security function of this installation. I was further told that you do not ask unnecessary questions." "Correct on both," he had said. "Good," she had said. "Then please take me somewhere that is not this bay, because this bay has a viewport that faces the approach corridor, and I would prefer not to be visible from the approach corridor." He had, without further comment, taken her somewhere else. This was already more words than he exchanged with most people in a week. What was happening, as she explained it over the next 40 minutes in the cramped secondary storage compartment he used as an unofficial operations room, a room no one else on the station used or visited, which was why he used it, was this: someone was trying to kill her. This was not unusual. Third daughters of Vethkai luminances were political assets, bargaining chips in the conclave's endless negotiation with the arm's other major species, which made them targets when those negotiations went wrong, or when someone decided they could go better with certain people removed from the equation. What was unusual was the method. It wasn't a direct assassination attempt, nothing so crude. Someone had arranged, with impressive bureaucratic precision, for her entire security detail to be recalled to the conclave capital on fabricated emergency orders. Someone had arranged for her scheduled diplomatic shuttle to develop a drive system fault that required an unscheduled maintenance stop at a waypoint station 4 hours from here. And someone had arranged for the 2 individuals waiting at Outpost Karini, 7, who were theoretically on her side, to have arrived a full day before she did. 2 individuals. Her diplomatic attaché, a senior Vethkai named Counselor Ruth, pale-ridged and silver-eyed, the kind of career diplomat who had survived 4 changes of luminance by being useful to everyone and owned by no one, or so the conventional assessment ran. And her father's intelligence liaison, a stocky bipedal Gan named Torvin, 4-eyed and flat-voiced, whose official function was to coordinate intelligence sharing between the luminance's household security and whatever station he was posted to. Both had been here a full day before anyone knew she was coming. "Who knew your actual travel itinerary?" Darren asked. "Counselor Ruth," she said, "Torvin, and the 3 members of my detail who were recalled." "And the detail members, you've confirmed they actually arrived at the capital?" A pause, very brief, the kind of pause that tells you more than the words that follow it. "I have not been able to confirm that," she said. "Right," he said. He'd checked his sidearm then. Not drawing it, just touching the grip, the way you touch a wall in the dark to know where you are. And he had thought about his rule. Nobody gets close to the asset. The problem was that in this case, someone already had. The question was which someone, and in which direction, and how much time he had before the geometry of the situation resolved itself without his input. "How long did it take you to get here from the waypoint station?" he asked. "Approximately 7 hours," she said. "The courier I obtained was not designed for speed." "And the waypoint station, how long were you there before you left?" "Long enough to understand that the fault in my shuttle's drive system was not accidental." Her skin markings flickered once, a brief pulse of something darker than amber. "The maintenance technician was not from the station. He could not tell me who had sent him. He could only tell me that he had been paid to ensure the delay lasted exactly 8 hours. Darren sat with that calculation. 8 hours was enough time for someone at this outpost to establish a cover story, arrange a physical setup, and be in position. 8 hours was a professional job. "Have you communicated with anyone since leaving the waypoint?" he asked. No, she said. I destroyed the primary comm on the courier before departure. If someone was monitoring for my signal, I preferred they not have one to monitor. He looked at her. That's not a standard royal response to this kind of situation. No, she agreed. The standard royal response is to send distress signals and trust that someone senior and sympathetic will respond appropriately. A pause. I decided to assume that the standard response was also the expected response, and that the expected response was what someone was counting on. Darren nodded slowly. He picked up his tablet and pulled up the outpost's personnel log. 2 Vethkai maintenance crew, he said, reading. Heth and Sorrel, both been here longer than any of our current guests. No connection to the Conclave's diplomatic function, no connection to the intelligence apparatus, no travel outside this outpost in the last 6 months. He looked up. They're not part of this. That leaves Ruth and Torvin, she said. Or one of them plus an external party they've been communicating with. Is that possible to determine? Give me an hour, he said. He found the message burst in 40 minutes. The outpost's communication logs were not encrypted from the inside. They were designed for diplomatic transparency, the Conclave's standard architecture for neutral waypoints, which operated on the principle that parties using the facility had agreed to basic monitoring as a condition of access. What this meant in practice was that Darren had legitimate access to every outgoing transmission that had left the station in the past 72 hours, and it took him the better part of 40 minutes to find the one that didn't fit. A compressed data burst, sent to a routing address that resolved to a commercial relay node in the Skethir system. Not a government channel, not an intelligence channel. Commercial-grade encryption, the kind used for business traffic, which was fast and cheap and not designed to withstand forensic examination. The kind you used when you were in a hurry and didn't think anyone would look that hard. Timestamp. 11 minutes after the scrambled shuttle had first pinged the outpost's approach beacon. 11 minutes. Someone had seen her coming and sent word before she'd even docked. He traced the originating terminal. It was one of the 6 portable comm units checked out to current station guests. He checked the checkout log. The unit had been assigned to Counselor Ruth. He sat with that for a moment, then he went looking for Torvin. The GAN intelligence liaison was in the secondary engineering bay when Darren found him, which was interesting. The engineering bay housed the atmospheric interface console, the system that controlled the outpost's life support and environmental functions, including the ability to adjust the atmospheric composition on any given deck. It was not a place a diplomatic intelligence liaison had any particular reason to be, unless that liaison was familiarizing himself with a system he planned to use. Torvin was holding a technical manual. He set it down when Darren came in, with the deliberate casualness of a man putting a card face down. Mr. Voss, Torvin said. The atmospheric console in secondary engineering has been put into maintenance mode, Darren said. This was not true. He said it the way you say things that are not true to see what shape the lie makes in another person's face, in case you were planning to use it. Torvin's 4 eyes didn't move, but his hands did, the smallest, quietest adjustment of his fingers against the tabletop, the kind of micro-movement you either noticed or didn't depending on how many years you'd spent in rooms with people who were hiding things. I'm not sure why I would be planning to use it, Torvin said. No, Darren said, I didn't think so. He left the engineering bay and went directly back to the communications hub. He pulled up Torvin's outgoing messages. They were clean. Either Torvin had been more careful than Ruth, or Torvin had used a channel Darren didn't have access to, or Torvin's role in this was not the communication role. He thought about that. Ruth sends the signal, Torvin controls the tool. Division of function. It was how you reduced exposure. One person knew where the asset was, The other person controlled the means of removal, and neither had the full picture from the outside. He thought about what the atmospheric console could do in the wrong configuration. He thought about the escape pod he hadn't checked yet. He went to check the escape pod. The pod nearest the upper diplomatic suite, the one closest to Ruth's quarters, had been accessed recently. The maintenance log showed a 12-minute entry the previous evening that was attributed to routine inspection, but the inspection had not been logged in the outpost's central maintenance system, which meant it had been logged locally and not uploaded. You did that when you didn't want the central system to have a record. Darren put on a set of inspection gloves from the maintenance kit by the pod bay door and opened the access panel on the fuel line. He found the device on the third check, a small magnetic clamp, attached to the secondary fuel coupling with the kind of professional precision that came from practice. He knew what it was before he'd fully identified it. He'd seen something similar once in the bad year, in a context he didn't revisit. It was not an explosive. It was a disabler. The pod would launch normally, burn normally for the first 90 seconds, and then the clamp would release a constrictor into the fuel line and the engine would die. The pod would drift. In this part of the upper atmosphere, with the gas giant's gravity well this close, a drifting pod would be recaptured by the planet within 6 to 8 hours. He photographed the device from 4 angles. He did not remove it. Then he sealed the panel and walked back to the storage compartment and told Sale what he'd found. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her skin markings at a steady, deep amber. When he finished, she said, "Ruth sends the signal. Torvin controls the atmospheric function. The pod is the intended escape route for whoever administers the removal, or the disposal method for me, or both." "That's my read," he said. "The pod that's been modified, it's the one nearest Ruth's suite." "Yes." "So the scenario is, Torvin triggers an atmospheric event on whatever deck I'm on. The event is calibrated to incapacitate humans and Vethkai at my physiological range. I am incapacitated. Ruth, who has a breather and prior knowledge of the event, retrieves me dead or incapacitated and puts me in the pod which he expects to function. He launches it. The planet does the rest. He reports a tragic accident. He is, after all, the sole senior survivor." She was quiet for a moment. "It is a competent plan." "It is," Darren said. "What is the failure point?" He looked at her. "You arrived without the expected warning time. They set this up assuming your shuttle would arrive on schedule with a full party. They've had to improvise, and improvising means they move faster than the plan was designed for, which means more chances for something to go wrong." He paused. "I'm also here, which I don't think was fully accounted for." She met his eyes. "Why not?" "Because the human contractor on a Vethkai diplomatic station is not usually the problem," he said. "I'm local staff, furniture. I enforce the rules of the facility. I don't intervene in the internal politics of the guests." "But you are intervening," she said. "You hired me," he said. "I walked off an unmarked shuttle," she said, "and asked you to take me somewhere safe. That is not the same as hiring you." He considered this. "Close enough," he said. He went to find Counselor Ruth next. The senior Vethkai diplomat was exactly where Darren expected him to be, in the main observation lounge on the upper deck, standing at the viewport, watching the storm below with his long-fingered hands clasped behind his back. The amber light from the gas giant caught the pale gold of his cranial ridges and turned them something close to luminous. He was very still. His skin markings were slow, the deep, meditative pulse of someone thinking through something carefully. "Mr. Voss," Ruth said without turning. He had heard Darren's approach from 20 meters out. "Excellent ears, Vethkai. Another evolutionary feature that didn't get enough credit. I was wondering when you would come to find me." "Were you?" Darren said. "You have been moving through the station with a purpose that suggests you've learned something interesting." Ruth turned now, and his silver eyes moved over Darren with the careful professional attention of someone who had spent 50 years reading people and had learned, somewhere in that time, to let you see him do it. I understand her radiance has arrived. She has. Under unusual circumstances. She had a rough transit. I imagine she did. Ruth looked at him for a moment. I would like to see her. That's not possible right now. Something moved across the counselor's face, too quick and too controlled to read completely. His skin markings flickered just once. Mr. Voss, I am the senior diplomatic representative of the luminance on this station. My responsibility to her radiance is not a preference. It is a function of my position. I need to. I understand your position, Darren said. She needs rest. I'll let you know when she's ready to meet. He held Ruth's eyes for exactly as long as the situation required, and then he left. Back in the storage compartment, Sale was at the table with the star charts, which he'd left open because he'd wanted to see how she read them, and she had, without being asked, simply started reading them. She read them well. Her finger traced routes between systems with the easy fluency of someone who'd grown up with this kind of map rather than learned it. Ruth knows you're here, he said. Of course he does, she said. His window faces the approach corridor. He saw the courier arrive. She didn't look up from the charts. What was his demeanor? Darren sat down across from her. Controlled. He let me see him reading the situation. That's usually a tell when someone shows you their process. They're showing you the part of it they want you to see. What is he hiding underneath the process? Urgency, Darren said. He used the word need. People who are doing what he's supposed to be doing, legitimate diplomatic protection, don't use that word under these circumstances. They're patient because the situation is under control. People who are on a timetable say they need. Sale was quiet for a moment, the timetable being whoever received his burst. The Skethir system. You said that's where the Havenmark Accord delegates are gathered. The outer system parties, yes, the ones with the most to gain from private enforcement. She looked up now, her amber eyes moving from the charts to his face. The Merveth Combine maintains a permanent delegation in Skethir. They have the deepest financial stake in the enforcement contract, and the most direct interest in removing my father's opposition to their bid. She paused. They are also the most likely party to have the resources to fund an operation like this. So Ruth is working for the Combine. Or with them. There is a difference. Men like Ruth rarely work for anyone. They work in parallel with entities whose interests align with theirs temporarily. She folded her hands. What does Ruth want that the Mervath Combine can provide? Darren thought about it, about the counselor's stillness, about a career diplomat who had survived 4 luminances by being useful to everyone, about the particular kind of ambition that doesn't want power directly, but wants to remain indispensable to power forever. Security, he said. If your father falls and the Combine takes the enforcement contract, Ruth is already positioned as the man who helped it happen. He survives the transition, more than survives. Sale nodded. It was a slow nod, the nod of someone confirming something they'd already calculated. He was my first diplomatic tutor. I was 8. He was very kind, not performed kindness, the actual thing, a pause that had weight in it. That makes it worse somehow. It usually does, Darren said. He spent the next 90 minutes making very quiet, very thorough adjustments to the station's systems. He rerouted the alert feeds for all emergency airlocks to his personal comm unit, which meant any attempt to cycle an airlock would reach him before it reached the standard alert system. He located the atmospheric interface console in secondary engineering and introduced a hidden interrupt into the control sequence. Not a full disable, because a full disable would be detected, but a step delay that required manual confirmation from a secondary terminal before any command executed. It bought time. 12 seconds, maybe 15. In a crisis, 15 seconds was either nothing or everything. He checked the escape pods again. All 4 of them. The modified one he left as he'd found it, photographed, documented, physically intact. Removing it would tell Ruth and Torvin that the pod had been discovered, and right now the value of their not knowing what he knew was higher than the value of removing the tool. He checked the station's comm relays and identified the 3 channels that were most likely to be used for a distress signal, and made sure they were open and clean. If he needed to call for help quickly, he wanted clean channels. He went back to the storage compartment and found Sale had reorganized his star charts into a schematic of the outpost's layout, using the navigational overlays to map the internal structure. She had marked, in a system of small notation he didn't immediately recognize, the positions of all 6 current occupants of the station and the likely movement patterns for each. He looked at it for a long moment. "Your mother taught you this," he said. "My mother's father was a tactical coordinator during the 3rd Expansion War," she said. "He taught her. She taught me. She said it was better to understand a space than to trust that someone else understood it on your behalf." He looked at the schematic. She'd gotten the layout right, not approximated right. He'd walked this station for 4 years. She'd been here for 2 hours and had the spatial relationships accurate to within a meter. "What's your read?" he asked. She considered the schematic. "They cannot move while the station's standard security systems are active and logged. Any significant action, atmospheric event, physical confrontation, leaves a record. They need a window in which the record is clean or can be explained." She traced a line across the overlay. The standard maintenance cycle on the atmospheric monitoring system runs for 22 minutes beginning at the 3rd hour cycle. During that window, the system records no anomalous data because it's not actively collecting. Any event during that window looks like a gap in the record rather than a covered event. She looked up. 3rd hour cycle begins in approximately 90 minutes. Darren looked at the same schematic. She was right about the maintenance window. He had known about it. He'd been checking the atmospheric logs around that window for 2 years, ever since a Vethkai trade delegation had come through with, in his assessment, an unusual interest in the station's environmental systems. He had not expected a royal who'd been on the station for 2 hours to know about it. "How did you calculate that?" he asked. "The maintenance cycle of any installation is usually pegged to a standard interval," she said, "and the atmospheric monitoring system on a facility this age will use the Conclave's standard 3-hour log cycle. 3rd hour puts the window at—" She stopped. "You already knew." "Yes," he said. "You wanted to know if I'd figured it out." "Yes," he said. She regarded him. "You've been testing me since I arrived." "I've been assessing you," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" He sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the table between them. "I've had 3 assets killed," he said, "in my career, not because I wasn't good enough, because I didn't know them well enough to predict them. The first one made a decision I didn't expect because I'd never understood how she thought. The second one communicated through a channel I didn't know he had. The third one trusted someone I'd already cleared because she knew him and I didn't." He paused. "Assessing you isn't about whether I trust you. I trust you. You've given me no reason not to. It's about knowing how you think under pressure, so I'm not surprised by you at a moment when surprise has a cost." Sale looked at him for a long moment. Her skin markings pulsed once, slowly, warm amber. "The 3 assets," she said, "did they survive?" "2 of them did," he said. "The third didn't." "I'm sorry." He moved on. 90 minutes until the window. They'll move in the window or not at all. Waiting any longer increases the risk of an official contact being made, and once official contact is made their window closes permanently. He looked at the schematic. "Ruth will need to be physically present wherever you are, or close enough to get there in the window's 22 minutes. Torvin will need access to the atmospheric system. That means they'll separate, one toward you, one toward engineering. which means neither of them has eyes on the other during the execution. Right, which means if I intercept Torvin first, Ruth proceeds without knowing Torvin has been neutralized. And if Ruth moves toward you before Torvin triggers the atmospheric event. He has no leverage, she said. He can't force the situation without the tool. He might have a secondary, Darren said. She nodded, the remote trigger. How do you know about the remote trigger? Because if I were Ruth, she said, I would have a remote trigger. A man who has built his career on never being fully dependent on any one ally would not run this operation without a personal override. She looked at him. He would have had access to the atmospheric system specifications. He would have had time to build or obtain a remote trigger during the day before I arrived. Darren sat with that. It landed with the weight of something he'd known was there, but hadn't fully articulated. If he has a remote trigger, he said, he doesn't need Torvin to be in position. He can trigger the atmospheric event from anywhere on the station. Yes, she said. Which means separating him from Torvin just separates them. It doesn't remove the threat. Yes, she said. So the question is which of them you neutralize first. Torvin without the trigger is harmless. Ruth with the trigger is the problem. She folded her hands. You need to take Ruth first. And leave Torvin free long enough that he might do something I haven't planned for. Yes. They sat with that problem. Outside, the gas giant turned in its storm. Stay in this room, Darren said. Whatever happens. Don't open that door for anyone except me. And if someone tries to come through it by force. He reached under the table and produced a compact stun unit from the equipment locker built into the table's underside. He set it in front of her. Vethkai physiology was compatible with the standard settings he'd already checked. Short range, he said, up close. She picked it up with the same practical steadiness with which she'd read the star charts. He stood. He told her about his sister then. He didn't plan to. It was not the moment he would have designed, but she asked why the rule existed and the answer was true, and he had spent long enough carrying true things that he said it without ornamentation. His sister, the colonial administrative posting, the enemies she'd made. The way Darren had thought he could protect her and know her simultaneously, and had discovered that the knowing made him slower, and the slowing was everything. Sale said, I'm sorry. He said, it was 5 years ago. She said, that doesn't make it not a thing to be sorry for. He picked up his sidearm. He did not think about what she'd said. He went to find Torvin. Torvin was where Darren expected him, in the corridor outside secondary engineering, making no particular effort to look casual, which was itself a kind of tell. A man making an effort to look casual looks one way. A man who has given up on looking casual and is simply standing where he needs to stand looks another way. Torvin looked the second way. The atmospheric console is in maintenance mode, Darren said. It was still not true. Torvin's 4 eyes tracked him with the lateral sweep that felt like not being looked at and was the opposite. I've had this conversation, Torvin said. I told you I don't know why I would need the console. You told me you don't know what I was suggesting, Darren said. Those are different things. A pause. I'm going to tell you something, Darren said. Not as a threat and not as a negotiation, just as information. Ruth sent the burst. I know which terminal, I know the timestamp, I know the routing address. Whatever arrangement you have with the Merveth Combine or with whoever is really handling this, Ruth is the connection. When this unravels, and it is going to unravel, Ruth is the thread they pull. He paused. You could be the man who helped stop it, or you could be the man who helped Ruth. Torvin was very still. The Gan's stillness was different from Vethkai's stillness, predatory rather than meditative, the quality of a body deciding whether the next action was worth the cost. If I cooperate, Torvin said carefully, what is the outcome for me? Complicated, Darren said honestly, but better than the alternative. Torvin struck. He was faster than his size suggested, which was the point of GAN physiology, which had been designed by millions of years of being the second largest predator on a planet of very large predators. He went not for Darren's weapon but for his throat, which was the correct move, which told Darren that Torvin had training. Going for the weapon was what untrained people did. Going for the person holding the weapon was what someone who understood the problem did. Darren stepped inside the reach. This was the geometry that had saved him more times than he could count, the understanding that the effective range of most attacks is defined by the attacker's body, and that if you put yourself inside that range before the attack fully develops, you become the geometry problem they haven't solved. He'd learned it in the Protection Corps, had refined it in the bad year, had maintained it through 4 years of a posting that rarely required it. The muscle memory was there. He used it. He caught Torvin's arm, used the forward momentum, put the GAN into the floor at a speed that was uncomfortable but not lethal. He held him there with a knee on the pressure point at the base of the neck, a universal solution, because everything that evolved a brain eventually evolved a vulnerability in the same approximate location. "Last offer," Darren said, breathing but not winded. Torvin calculated. Darren could feel it, the small movements of a body weighing physics against options. "Ruth has a remote trigger," Torvin said. "I know. The trigger bypasses any modification you've made to the atmospheric system. His override is hardwired to a direct line in the engineering relay, not the console, the relay. He didn't need me near the console at all." A pause. "I was a contingency, in case the pod was found." "The pod was found." "I know," Torvin said. "I could tell from how you spoke to me earlier." "Where is Ruth now?" "He went to find her," Torvin said. 8 minutes ago. He said if the pod was compromised, he was moving to the direct approach." Darren was moving before Torvin finished the sentence. "He ran." "The lower corridor, the junction, the main lift which was too slow, so the maintenance ladder instead hand over hand, 3 decks in a space meant for AI who were taller and had differently articulated joints. He was pulling up his comm unit as he moved, hitting the channel for the storage compartment, getting nothing back. The signal was scrambled, which meant the diplomatic privacy screen was active, which meant someone with diplomatic override authority had activated it from outside the room. "Ruth." The door was locked when he reached it. Diplomatic override keyed to Ruth's credentials, the kind of lock that was designed to be absolute and was, in most circumstances. Most. He used the emergency maintenance bypass he'd memorized on his first week on this station 4 years ago, a 12-digit code that the Vethkai maintenance protocols included for exactly the scenario, where a diplomatic override locked a crew member out of an area that needed servicing. Nobody had told him about it. He'd found it in the maintenance manual. Reading maintenance manuals was the kind of thing that took 4 years of a remote posting, and the particular mindset of someone who had learned that what kept you alive wasn't speed or strength, but the specific and unglamorous practice of knowing things before you needed to know them. The door opened. He went through it with his sidearm up and his hands steady. Ruth was across the room. He stood very still, the way he'd stood at the viewport, with his hands held in front of him and one of those hands holding a small flat device, silver, the size of a credit chip, the atmospheric remote that Torvin had just confirmed. His skin markings were completely still, not meditative, stopped. The stillness of someone who has made their decision and is simply waiting for the execution to begin. Sale was against the far wall. She was not afraid in the way that was supposed to be visible. She was not shaking. She was not pleading. She was watching Ruth with her amber eyes, and the expression on her face was the one that Darren had been unable to categorize in the storage compartment earlier and now placed. It was the refusal to make this the version of events that simply happened to her. The refusal to become the passive object of someone else's arithmetic. "Mr. Voss," Ruth said, without looking at him, You have been considerably more difficult than anticipated. Ruth, Darren said. He kept his sidearm level. Put the remote down. I don't think I'll do that, Ruth said. You'll note that there's no scenario in which you can shoot me without my hand reflexively closing on the trigger. At this range, the atmospheric event will incapacitate you in approximately 40 seconds, and her radiance in. What does the Mervith Combine pay you? Darren asked. Ruth paused. His silver eyes moved to Darren, and in them was the expression of a man who recognizes a delaying tactic and is calm enough not to be entirely immune to it. This isn't about payment, he said. You know that. Men like me don't do this kind of thing for money. We do it for continuity. The faintest trace of something that was not quite sadness moved across his face. Her father is going to lose this negotiation one way or another. I've watched 4 luminances lose their positioning arguments, Mr. Voss. What I've learned is that the men who survive those losses are the men who were useful to what came after. A pause. I was useful to her when she was 8 years old. I can be useful to what comes after her now. The arithmetic is simple. You taught her to read star charts, Darren said. I taught her many things, Ruth said. She was an exceptional student. Something moved in his voice, genuine and therefore worse. This is not personal. Everything is personal, Darren said. His sidearm was steady. The shot was clean, but a nervous hand on a trigger didn't care about clean shots. He ran the geometry and came up short by exactly one variable. The time between the shot landing and Ruth's hand completing its reflex arc. He made a decision. He threw his sidearm across the room, not at Ruth, past him, to the right, where it clattered against the far wall and skidded under a storage cabinet with a sound that was clearly, unavoidably audible. Ruth's eyes tracked it. Every person in every room in every species at every level of training tracks a thrown object. It's not a choice. It's older than choices. 2 seconds. Sail came off the wall. She moved the way she'd read the star charts, with the spatial intelligence of someone who understood vectors, who had grown up in environments where miscalculating distance wasn't an inconvenience but a consequence. 4 meters in 2 seconds, which doesn't sound remarkable until you watch someone do it and understand that most people in that moment. The moment when a plan is in motion, and the room is charged, and the stakes are absolute, freeze in a way that's not cowardice, but simply the brain's processing lag between seeing an opening and understanding it. She didn't freeze. She drove the heel of her palm into Ruth's wrist, not the hand holding the remote, the wrist, with a joint-lock precision that was not standard AI formal technique. It was something older. Her grandfather's lessons, translated through her mother, landed now in a storage compartment on a crescent station above a gas giant. The joint locked. The wrist bent at an angle it wasn't designed to sustain. The remote left Ruth's hand. Darren was already moving. He covered the room in 3 strides and caught the remote one-handed before it completed its arc to the floor. Ruth lunged, desperate, the desperation of a man whose arithmetic has just stopped adding up, reaching for the device with the single-minded urgency of someone who has only one move left. Darren stepped into it, the same geometry as Torvin, the same result. Ruth went down hard and Darren held him there and produced a zip cuff from his vest pocket and applied it with a thoroughness that was not gentle. He knelt there for a moment, breathing in the particular way you breathe when the worst part is over and the body is catching up to the fact. Then he looked up at Sale. You were supposed to stay in the room, he said. She met his eyes. I was in the room and then you came in, and then the situation changed. You could have been hit. I was not hit. He had a remote trigger. His thumb was not on it, she said. It was on the side of the device, a resting grip. He was holding it as a threat, not as a trigger ready to activate. The angle required to fire it would have taken him a full second to establish. I had less distance to cover than that. He looked at her. You calculated that, he said. While you were talking to him, she said. Yes. He stood up. He looked at the remote in his hand, then back at her. Your mother's father was a tactical coordinator. Yes. And your mother insisted you learn. She said that being protected was a kind of debt, and she had spent enough of her life in debt. He was quiet for a moment. The station hummed around them. The storm turned below in its ancient, enormous patience. Your mother, he said, was right about a lot of things. She was right about most things, Sale said. She was wrong about a few. She thought she could carry everything herself. She died carrying something she should have let someone else hold for her. A pause. She didn't like owing anyone anything either. It was her best quality and her worst one simultaneously. Darren looked at the remote trigger in his hand. I need to secure Torvin, he said. Yes. And signal the conclave on a clean channel. Yes. And then hold position for however long it takes for an official ship to arrive. Approximately 4 hours, she said, based on the nearest conclave enforcement vessel's last logged position. He had not known the last logged position of the nearest conclave enforcement vessel. He had not checked it. She had, apparently, while waiting. He almost said something. He didn't. The 4 hours were not quiet. They were not peaceful, but they were something other than what the previous hours had been, and that something was enough. Torvin talked once properly restrained, and presented with the clear reality that Ruth's plan had failed completely. He was a practical man. Darren had assessed that correctly from the beginning, and practical men recalculate when the variables change. He talked about the Mervath Combine's involvement, about the intermediaries, about a data cache that would give the conclave investigators enough to begin tracing the money, and the communication trails back through 3 years of carefully managed corruption in the Havenmark negotiations. Darren listened and recorded and kept his voice neutral and his face quiet, because that was what you did with people who were calculating whether to cooperate, and anything that looked like satisfaction would remind them that their cooperation was benefiting someone other than themselves. He checked in on Ruth once, who was still zip-cuffed in the storage compartment and silent in the way of a man who has recognized that talking will only make things worse. Ruth was, underneath everything, a professional. Professionals knew when to stop. He spent an hour verifying that all 3 communication channels he'd identified were clean, that his emergency signal had gone through, that the conclave enforcement vessel had acknowledged receipt and was en route. He spent another hour walking the station one more time, every system, every panel, every piece of equipment that had a function he needed to understand, because the checking was the thing, the specific and unglamorous work of knowing where you were and what was around you, and because it was something to do with his hands while the 4 hours passed. He spent the last 2 hours in the storage compartment with Sale. Not planning, not assessing, just present. She asked him questions, not the questions that people asked when they wanted something from you, but the questions that people asked when they were genuinely curious about the shape of another person's life, about the colonial authority, about what it had been like to leave the inner systems, about the gas giant visible through the small viewport at the end of the room, turning in its amber storm, and whether he'd ever wondered what it was like down there in those clouds. He told her he'd looked it up once, that the planet was too hot for most known life, but that 3 years ago a research team had found evidence of what might be a thermochemical organism at the upper edge of the lower cloud layer, something that processed sulfur compounds and used the thermal differential between storm layers as an energy source, that nobody had been able to confirm it definitively, that they'd named the potential organism after the planet's designation and moved on, which he found, personally, inadequate. Because if it exists, she said, it has been here the entire time we've been having this crisis above it. Yes, he said, and it doesn't know, or if it knows it doesn't care, or if it cares it's in a way we can't recognize yet. She was quiet for a moment. That's either comforting or terrible. I think it's both, he said, depending on the moment. She told him about growing up in the conclave capital, about the weight of ceremony, the endless succession of formal occasions designed to turn a person into a symbol, the way the symbol was supposed to be grateful for the attention without noticing what it cost, about the particular loneliness of being a political asset, visible everywhere and present nowhere, about her mother, who had quietly and consistently maintained the position that Sale was a person before she was a symbol, and that anyone who forgot the order of those two things was not worth the effort of correcting. She sounds like someone who was very hard to fool, Darren said. She was impossible to fool, Sale said. She knew exactly what every person in every room wanted, and she kept it in mind at all times, and she was never unpleasant about it, which I found the most impressive part. She knew that everyone in the conclave was managing some angle, some interest, some calculation, including her, and she simply accounted for it rather than being bitter about it. Including you, he asked. A pause. She knew what I wanted, Sale said. She knew before I did. She had the quality of very clear-eyed people, which is that they see you better than you see yourself, and it is either a gift or a burden depending on what they do with it. A pause. She did not use it to manage me. She used it to prepare me for what I was going to want when I understood it. And what was that? Sale looked at the star charts, spread across the table between them. To be useful, she said, not as a symbol, as a person, to understand the systems and the spaces and the geometry of things well enough to actually do something with the position I'd been given. She looked up. Being a third daughter means being a bargaining chip. My mother's view was that a bargaining chip who understood the negotiation was a different order of thing entirely from one that didn't. Darren looked at the schematic she'd made from his star charts, at the 2 hours of work that had mapped a station she'd never been on, tracking 6 people through an operation she'd had no prior warning of. She was right about that too, he said. The conclave enforcement ship arrived in 4 hours and 12 minutes, which was 8 minutes faster than Sale had estimated, and which she noted with a quiet, assessing nod. The senior official who came aboard spent the first 20 minutes asking Darren specific and increasingly pointed questions about why the conclave's senior diplomatic attaché to the princess's transit detail was secured with a zip cuff to a cooling pipe in a storage compartment. Darren answered every question with accuracy and completeness, and left nothing out and added nothing in. Then the official moved to interview Sale, and Darren went to the observation lounge. He stood at the viewport where Ruth had been standing when Darren first found him, watching the same storm that had been turning all day below. The same amber spirals, the same enormous patient violence of a gas giant that had been doing this for 4 billion years, and would do it for 4 billion more, and did not notice the crescent-shaped station anchored in its upper atmosphere any more than a river notices a leaf. He thought about his sister, not the way he usually thought about her, which was with the particular discipline of controlled regret, of incident analysis, of the professional practice of understanding what had gone wrong so it did not go wrong again. He thought about her the way you think about someone when you've been reminded, specifically and unexpectedly, that grief doesn't actually teach you not to care. It teaches you to be careful about it, which is a different thing, and which can look from a distance like the same thing but isn't. He thought about the rule. Nobody gets close to the asset. The rule was still there. It would always be there. He didn't think it had been wrong. It had been right about what it was designed to protect against, the hesitation, the miscalculation, the choice made in fog instead of clarity. He had not hesitated today. He had been clear. He had run the geometry and made the call. The call had also included throwing his sidearm across the room. He turned that over for a moment. The thing about the rule, the limitation the rule had that he hadn't articulated to himself before today, was that it was designed for a unidirectional relationship. One person protecting another. One person with all the information, all the agency, all the capacity for action, keeping another person safe by managing the distance between them and everything dangerous. What he'd had today was different. Today he'd had two people in a room, both of whom had information, both of whom had agency, both of whom were capable of action, and who had arrived at a shared problem from different angles, and in the moment when the geometry resolved, had done two different things that together made the solution. He couldn't have done it alone. Throwing the sidearm bought 2 seconds. Sail covering 4 meters in those 2 seconds was the rest of it. Neither half worked without the other. He was still standing there when he heard footsteps. "The official wants a full deposition," Sale said, coming to stand beside him at the viewport. "Not close. A professional distance, an appropriate distance." "I know." "He also wants to know whether I'm requesting a new security detail, or whether the current arrangement is satisfactory." He kept his eyes on the storm. "What did you tell him?" he asked. A pause, the kind of pause that has been considered before being allowed. "I told him," she said, "that the current arrangement had performed adequately under significant adverse conditions, and that I would make a final determination following further evaluation." "Further evaluation," he said. "I'm a diplomat," she said. "We don't commit prematurely." He was quiet for a moment. The storm turned, the station breathed. "The rule," he said. "The rule," she agreed. And then, after another moment, the considered and precise voice of someone who has spent her life learning exactly how words land in exactly what order. "Rules are useful because they simplify decisions under conditions of uncertainty. When conditions become sufficiently clear, the simplification becomes unnecessary." He finally looked at her. The amber eyes, the cut on her cranial ridge, sealed with the med kit, a fine line of dark gold where it had bled. The skin markings at a steady, slow pulse, not the composed stillness she'd managed through the crisis, but something else, something quieter. The expression of someone who has done the math and arrived at an answer and is, simply, without pressure, waiting. "That," he said, "is a very diplomatic way of saying what you just said." "Yes," she said, "I've had practice." Below them, the gas giant turned, and somewhere in the upper boundary of its lower cloud layer, something that might have been a thermochemical organism processed sulfur compounds in the thermal differential between storm systems and didn't know or care about any of this. The station, the crisis, the two people at the viewport, the particular complicated small business of being alive. "Further evaluation," he said. "Further evaluation," she confirmed. He looked back at the storm. He would give the deposition. He would be thorough and accurate and leave nothing out. He would deal with the paperwork and the questions and the bureaucratic weight of everything that followed a crisis correctly resolved. He would continue to walk the perimeter every morning, because that was the thing that belonged entirely to him, and he did not intend to stop. He would also, in the days that followed, answer the questions she asked about the gas giant below, about the potential organism, about what it might mean if it was real, about what you called a thing that had survived for millions of years in an environment that should have made life impossible. He didn't know the answer to that last one. He thought he might spend a while finding it. The rule was still there. It would always be there. It had kept him alive, and had kept people he was responsible for alive, and it was not wrong. It was just, as it turned out, not complete. Nobody gets close to the asset. The asset, Darren Voss thought, had not waited to be gotten close to. She had done the geometry herself in 2 seconds across 4 meters, with a precision that her grandfather had developed and her mother had carried and she had inherited and earned. That was not his rule. That was something else entirely. He breathed. Below, the gas giant rolled in its amber storm, enormous and patient and entirely uninterested in the small, complicated, stubbornly persistent business of human beings, deciding what they were going to hold on to and what they were going to let change. Some things didn't need the whole universe to agree. Some things were just decided, quietly, in the space between one breath and the next. He went to give his deposition. He did not walk quickly. He took the long way, through the lower corridors, through the cyan bioluminescent light that breathed with each atmospheric shift, through the smell of ozone and something sweet that he had stopped noticing a long time ago and was now, for reasons he didn't examine too closely, noticing again. He checked the systems as he passed them, every panel, every readout, the atmospheric monitors all green, the emergency airlocks sealed and logged. The escape pods, all 4 of them, accessible and intact, one of them soon to be removed from service pending the Conclave's technical review of the device attached to its fuel line. He checked all of it. He did not skip anything. It was, after all, the first thing he did every morning. It was the thing that was entirely his to control. He checked it, and it was in order, and he walked on. Outside, the stars held their positions, cold and clear and very far away, indifferent to rules, and the people who made them and the small, complicated grace of knowing when to follow one, and when to understand that you already were just differently and better than you'd understood before.